Alrighty, friends. So, welcome to Social Identities and Intersectionality. As promised, we are going to continue our conversation from our last session on different components to social identities that impact our work experiences. So, as always, we're going to start off with some objectives. Today, our objectives are to define exactly what intersectionality is. We're going to examine social class theory and the implications that classism has on the workplace. I'm also going to introduce or reintroduce chronemics, which I spoke to a little bit during our last session, which is the polychronic versus monochronic cultures. I'm also going to introduce high versus low context cultures. And we're going to begin developing some shared language and understanding for cultivating equitable and inclusive working environments. So to start us off, intersectionality is the theory essentially of how our interwovenness, how our identities are interwoven in components such as race, class, sexual orientation, gender, how those identities are woven together to provide us with experiences of either, compounded privilege and or oppression. This term was coined by attorney Kimberly Williams Crenshaw to help describe the intersection that individuals experience based on their identities, specifically within the judicial system. So if you haven't seen Kimberly Williams Crenshaw's TED Talk on intersectionality, I definitely recommend having a look at that. So Crenshaw says that intersectionality is a lens through which we can see where power comes and collides, and where it locks and intersects. And it is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege, because we don't live one-dimensional lives, and we certainly are not one-dimensional people. So I'd like you to take a moment to think about your identity. When you think about yourself, what social demographics first come to mind when you think about yourself? And you can feel free to unmute yourself and share that or put it in the chat.
Recording.
One more time. Okay. You see gender, ethnicity, class, your hometown.
Education.
What's that?
Education.
Education, yeah. Yeah. And when you think of these identities, friends, how do those identities influence your life?
I mean, they affect how you see others and, your unconscious biases as well, and how you respond to other people.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying, Allie, it kind of informs a lens that we have about ourselves and others?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Soul says fear to be in certain areas. Soul, can you say more about that?
Weirdly small, and I'm trying to make it work. Okay, there we go. It's back. But just that idea that, if you're in certain, whether it's, social demographics or whatnot, that if you go to an area where people don't accept that or don't like or believe in a certain thing, that you just always have that thought in the back of your mind that you're not necessarily safe.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about how your social demographics, your identity influences your life?
Just quickly for me, August, mine is giving me opportunities that other folks don't have. Pretty cognizant of that sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, when I travel, I often am reminded about just just the privilege of being able-bodied, right? Like how there are just certain things I don't ever have to think about and consider as I navigate the world. There are other things I have to consider, right? There are huge parts of my identity, but yeah, that interwovenness for sure. Let's see, I'm going to check the chat again. Oh yeah, so Peter says it shapes what we think of as normal. Yeah, especially as it relates maybe to those around us and their social identities. Great. So an intersectional analysis requires that we shift from having that single ground perspective to an analysis that is based on the assumption that individual experiences are based upon multiple identities, right? That can be linked to more than one ground of discrimination, oppression, or privilege and opportunity. So some examples of this, especially around gender and sexual orientation, can be found right within our system of law. So as an example, right now, it is still legal in many states to fire, evict, or deny services to someone for being LGBTQ, especially as it relates to adoption and even health coverage. And not all states have family leave policies that extend to same-sex couples, especially in places like Michigan, North Dakota, and Virginia. And there's also significant discriminatory and adoption fostering policies. As an example, here in Wisconsin, policy, I'm going to mute folks. We still have a policy where if you are fostering a child, both you and your partner have equal say in the the well-being of that child and being able to take them to the doctor. But once you adopt a child, only one of you can be listed as a parent, which oftentimes causes some significant issues, especially if one is a stay-at-home parent, but they're not the primary holder of perhaps like the health insurance, for example, versus the other parent who is working full-time. And what's really interesting to note is that there are 5 times as many LGBTQ identified parents who are willing to adopt than there are children in foster care. So essentially, right, if we were to eliminate these discriminatory practices, we could solve for the foster care crisis. As it relates to other aspects of gender, just to kind of bring us back down memory lane, we have the business loan discrimination, where women were not allowed to acquire a business loan in their own name without a male cosigner until 1988. Spousal rape was not considered a crime until 1993. Women were also not allowed to acquire a credit card in their own name until 1974. And workplace sexual harassment was also not considered a form of discrimination until 1980. So our identities intersect and overlap, right, to inform the experiences that we have. And so when we are creating policies and evaluating practices within the workplace, it's imperative that we also take an intersectional lens and recognize that policies don't impact people neutrally. So here's an example of, that I'm borrowing from an artist, Sylvia Duckworth, that kind of shows the power of privilege and power. The cycle of power and privilege, right? Where we see the center, we have the components of identity that have been shown to offer folks privileges. And then we have surrounding that components that contribute to marginalization. And these are all directly correlated to laws, policies, common practices, and cultural norms as well. So we're going to talk about socioeconomics a bit today in hopes of continuing on and building on our web to help us fully understand, again, how these components of oppression intersect and create these levels of experiences, right? From an institutional lens, systemic, individual, and personal as well. So as an example, the top 1% of our nation's wealthiest people hold about 20% of the nation's wealth, whereas the bottom 50% of our population holds only 12% of our nation's wealth. And there's some modern day implications and historical components that have contributed to that. Of course, as we talked about in our very first session, policies that are held by or were held by our federal government in relation to who received backing for their home loans, right? We learned in our first session that $120 billion in tax money went exclusively, 98% of that went exclusively to whites. How non-white veterans were often unable to access education loans due to segregationist university policies, which then again contributes to earning potential. The Social Security Act, which excluded domestic and wage workers, which impacted mostly people of color, specifically the Black population, because 75% of the population fell into that category. The Wagner Act, which made labor union monopolies legal and allowed discrimination of membership based on gender and race. Non-whites who were unable to utilize VA home loans and access mortgages due to racist banking and insurance practices, and also having to navigate racially restrictive covenants and redlining. So all of those policies and practices contributes to where we are today. So right now, white households tend to hold about 84% of the nation's wealth, whereas Black households hold about 4% of the nation's wealth. And you'll note the percentages of these individuals or these communities within the population as well. I want to go back and for a moment, just note here, this rise and fall between 2007 and 2010, again, that was the housing bubble. Now, when we think about race and gender, as well as social status, right? So marital status, we also see a very different story being told and showing up based on the identities of the folks we're evaluating. You can see here, there's a significant difference amongst the wealth acquisition between white men and women and Black men and women specifically. So these modern day implications are also correlated to the war on drugs, which, as we noted in our first session, how during 1971, President Nixon declared the war on drugs and declared drug usage public enemy #1, which then directly correlated to an influx in the prison system. And then with that expansion, we also saw an increase in the 80s and 90s from 50,000 people to 400,000 by 1997. So just to remind us of where we looked at or where we were before, you can see again the spike correlated directly with the war on drugs policy or policies related to that. And how this is transferred today is very much so into the prison labor system, right? So as we learned in our second session, due to the way the 13th Amendment is written, it is still legal to invoke forcible labor onto anyone who's been convicted of a crime. And what is forced labor but slavery? So here's where we are in terms of the correlation between the 13th Amendment and the prison labor. So there are roughly 10 corporations who control most of the household brands that we buy, right? From paper towels to cleaning supplies to clothing. And it's also fairly unknown exactly how big the prison labor industry is. The last nationwide census of prisons was done in 2005. And at that time, 1.5 million people were incarcerated. The United States holds about 25% of the global incarcerated population total. So as of the last census, we knew that about 600,000 people were working in the manufacturing sector, and were incarcerated. So incarcerated labor makes up about 4% of the industry. And most of the individuals who are working for certain companies while they're incarcerated are actually not eligible to do the same job they were doing while incarcerated once they get out because of the hiring policies of those institutions and those corporations. So individual prison systems and state legislatures decide how they count and regulate their prison labor. Oh, I'm missing. Oh, we'll get back to that. So some examples, right, of household names that utilize or have utilized prison labor are Whole Foods. Prior to 2016, Whole Foods sold, as an example, a 12-pound bag of tilapia that was labeled that it came from sustainable family American farms. But in actuality, it came from Colorado prisons, where the workers who helped to farm that tilapia were making about 74 cents a day, including some of the artisanal cheeses that Whole Foods was selling, also came directly from Colorado prisons. Victoria's Secret is another example of a women's clothing store that utilized female inmates to sew apparel via third-party corporation known as Third Generation, who subcontracted that work out. Whistleblowing inmates were also placed in solitary confinement when they had exposed that they were required to remove labels that stated "Made in Honduras" from the garments from Victoria's Secret and replace them with "Made in America" labels. McDonald's, which is another fast food giant, has used prison labor to make thousands of their uniforms and process a lot of its frozen foods. Unicor is a name that we should all know. Under the US federal law, as I mentioned, all physically able inmates who are not deemed a security threat are required to work for either Unicor or some other entity while they are incarcerated. And Unicor is a state-owned corporation, and it basically contracts out incarcerated workers to private companies. This was established by Congress in 1934. And the private prisons currently charge about $150 per day per inmate. That is, and the only time we go with private industry is when they can prove that they can charge less than the state-run agencies. So this means that state-run agencies or public prisons actually are, it's costing taxpayers more than $150 per day to incarcerate people. So you can kind of do the math of what it would cost to pay people a livable wage, perhaps to address some poverty versus incarceration. Right now, the US incarcerates about 2.19 million people. Unicor manages about 83 factories. And then those inmates as of this year are earning between 23 cents an hour to $1.15 an hour. Most of those funds actually go to purchase like hygiene items such as deodorant, soap, shampoo, feminine hygiene products. The most recent report from Unicor reported that it had about 17,000 incarcerated workers doing everything from heavy manufacturing to computer-aided design. And again, we don't have very good documentation of what incarcerated workers are actually doing because it's left up to the states to track that. We do know, however, from that last report that Unicor brings in about $500 million in revenue annually from contracted prison labor. So we're going to talk about, again, like how these social inequities contribute to the system, because if we don't understand what's driving the inequity, we can't like solve for it. So I'm going to pause there just to check the chat for a moment. Okay. Yeah, wildfires as well. When they're out like on hubris. Yeah. Cool. All right. So let's talk about social class theory, right? And the gateways into that. So socioeconomic status needs to be a component that we factor into our inclusion efforts because most workplaces and cultures of work are built and tailored by and for middle-class norms. This means that many of our traditional workplaces are essentially skewed to support the values and norms of those who belong to the middle class. And they don't often account for someone who might come from a more financially challenged background, which can then consequently produce some struggle in day-to-day life culture if that's not a common experience, or there are different norms that come up. So one of the ways that companies operate, for example, in regards to salary, higher education, time management, those are aspects that are deeply influenced by the creators of the culture, right? Who gets opportunities to public speak, how meetings are ran. And it's mostly from bosses, right? Supervisors who were also raised with those middle class norms and values. And those middle class norms and values can at times feel foreign to someone who was not raised under similar circumstances. So when we talk about class and intersectionality, just so we're on the same page about what we mean by class, we're referring to a person's relative social status as it relates to their income, wealth, power, and or position within society. So although distinctions between working class, low income, middle class, upper owning, et cetera, can mean different things to different people, they're very much so interconnected with race and gender and sexual orientation, immigration status, regional location, religion, age, right? And so this makes it quite difficult to separate out as a factor. And that's why when we do our assessment together for ACE, for members and for staff, we are going to be asking about your staff and your members, parents or legal guardians' highest level of education attainment, because while it's not a perfect science, it's the best tool we have for evaluating and measuring what someone's potential socioeconomic upbringing was. In addition to this, we want to be mindful that class-based segregation can generate feelings of guilt for folks who come from more privileged backgrounds, and also potentially shame for those who come from less privileged positions. And so these factors alone can make having conversations about classism extremely difficult to navigate. So my hope today is to give us some language by which to navigate some of these conversations around norming within our workplace culture. So let's start out with how we learn about social class. So I'm going to minimize my camera here, or my video. So in the home as children, we begin to learn lessons, messaging about opportunities and resources very early, right? We hear from our parents attitudes and perspectives around money, resources, food, all that sort of thing. And as children, we learn hidden rules for survival. And the way that a parent or a legal guardian and other family members communicate around opportunities and resources is a very powerful way to reinforce those different aspects of classism. So as an example, some parents who are raised in a more in a working class background and household might approach disciplining their child with a phrase that sounds something like this. Now, Caden, or maybe they would say, Caden, if you're misbehaving, like, knock it off, like, don't ever do that again. Whereas a parent, for example, who is raised in a more affluent household and has been conditioned for self-advocacy, their phrasing to a child may sound something more like this. Caden, was that the best decision you could have made for yourself? What might happen if you continue to make decisions that way, right? So on one hand, and again, this is not a rule, this is more of an art than anything, but and Ruth Payne, I think is her name, has done some research around this, although there are some criticisms to Ruth Payne's research as it relates to schools, if any of you are familiar with that pedagogy. But on one hand, for the parents who are working class, what can often be a priority is simply survival itself. And so, there is no time to sit down and walk through all the steps and to impart critical thinking, right? We just want to shut down the behavior because we can't afford to make mistakes like that. Whereas for the middle class to more affluent class, the value is on developing that sense of self-advocacy, developing those critical thinking skills. So when we think about survival, it's important to know, again, what is important to different groups. Much like in our very first session together, the reflective leadership one, I had you identify what your true color was. Again, this is to help us understand how people value communication, or what types of communication they value, how they want to be communicated with, and how they don't want to be communicated with. Because if we don't understand what's driving someone's internal value system, it's really hard to get on the same page. So what survival means to us is often dependent on which social class we were raised in. Now, some of you who may have been raised in households with dual social class, like, so for example, one parent may have come from a more affluent household and one not. As an example, my father was raised fairly affluently, in a Jewish household, and my stepmom was raised in a very working class, farm background household, Roman Catholic in the Philippines. And when I started studying these different components and different cultures around class, I finally understood why their parenting styles were so different. So some of you may be able to note some of that as well in your own upbringing, or perhaps in your own families at this time. Again, there are always exceptions to the rule, but having this foundational understanding can help us understand what's driving these differences, these hidden rules for survival. So some of the three main characters or main factors of note for working class individuals, and I say generational poverty because we cannot save ourselves out of poverty, and we understand, I hope now, that there is not a shortage of money in the world. We simply have wealth inequality, and that stems back far earlier than any of you and I have come to be. But understanding that for folks of the working class, the factors for survival are based primarily on relationships, entertainment, and survival itself. For folks of the upper class or generationally wealthy, the determining factors or the hidden rules and concepts for survival are based on financial, political, and social connection. For the middle class, the values or the determining factors for survival are achievement, work ethic. Alex, would you mind muting everyone? I'm getting some feedback and I can't get to the button. Thank you. And then self-sufficiency. These are critical components to middle class norms and values.
We lost you, August.
You were
I think
muted
you're muted
as
too.
well.
Sorry. So because of the predominant social class in America being middle class, the focus on achievement, work itself, self-sufficiency, that very much so drives American culture, at least North American culture. When we look into our school systems, also because of historical segregation, we have working class schools and we have middle class and affluent schools. And our young people's experiences and our experiences as children navigating the school systems, depending on where we went to school, also influence our perception of resources and opportunities. So for example, a teacher in a working class school may communicate the value of resources by saying, okay, August, like you can totally use those markers, but as soon as you're done, make sure you put them back so the other kids can use them, right? Whereas in a more affluent school system, everyone has their own crayons, right? Or their own markers. Their student and teacher interactions are also very different, as well as the parent and teacher interactions are different, which I want to talk about for a second. So in terms of school access, we know that 3% of students in the top universities come from the bottom economic percentile, whereas 74% of students at our nation's top universities come from middle class and upper class backgrounds. When it comes to school autonomy, again, this is like the relationship between the students and the teachers. Working class schools tend to prepare students for working class jobs with higher supervision and less autonomy, whereas middle class and upper class schools tend to reflect and promote more expressive ideas. They tend to provide opportunities for students to experience more complex and varied tasks. And students are often encouraged to ask questions, to challenge their teacher, and to have more autonomy and decisions around their school experience. Now, this doesn't mean that we are not seeing a shift in our school system as we're learning more about pedagogy, we're learning more about youth development. But historically, these are the more prevalent cultures that we see within the school systems that can be directly correlated to outcomes. In terms of interactions, working class students may feel ignored by their teachers, who oftentimes have a much higher student load as well, but may also fear that their asking for help may be perceived as a weakness versus curiosity. Whereas in middle class and upper class schools, students, are encouraged to ask their teachers more questions, and that intellectual curiosity is often rewarded and encouraged. We also see this manifesting even in higher ed, where students who are the first in their families to go to college may not have anyone in their family that can help them navigate academia, right? And help them navigate the financial aid system. And so many universities are implementing different support systems and offices to help first generation college students. But you're still seeing a certain level of fear or concern or hesitation for first generation college students to seek out help because of a lot of things, right? Stereotype threat, just simply not knowing what they don't know, versus students who are coming into that experience with multiple family members having gone before them and experienced that. And again, this is across like age, gender, race. When it comes to parental advocacy, what we also see is that working class parents may not often have the knowledge required to advocate for their children's needs, especially when their children might have some neurodivergence. Whereas middle class and upper class parents are more equipped to take charge and influence their children's education. They may be able to seek out after school programming, move their child to a different school that is more supportive of their child's learning style. But what the research has also found is that there's absolutely no difference between the care and the concern that parents have for their children's education, regardless of their socioeconomic background. It's just that the skills and the opportunities for advocacy are not equal. And then we come into the workplace, right? So this is where we start to see those political roles. And I don't mean politics like Republican, Democratic. I mean like politics in terms of, social politics around power, around behavior. We start to see glass ceilings, and we also see how a manager's perspective around what constitutes a great or a good employee impact who gets an opportunity for advancement also. So one example I like to use with this in terms of how managers might inadvertently contribute to inequality or and inequity is with the model minority myth. Right. So this assumption that Asian American staff are that they are very agreeable and that they don't ruffle any feathers and they do what they're told and they don't self-advocate or self-promote. Those might be categories that some managers feel are really positive and make for a great employee, but consequently, those are not the same qualities that a manager would perceive that are perceived to be great leadership skills. And so while we are seeing great retention for Asian American staff in the North American workforce, and deep value for them, we're not seeing that translate into opportunities for advancement. So there are two types of behaviors that we tend to see manifest in the workplace: the pro-social behavior and the political behavior. So for pro-social behavior, we see a significant focus on collaboration and concern with mutual benefit for all. Whereas political behavior can be deemed more self-promoting, self-advocacy, right? Keeping track, for example, of all of one's accomplishments so that during the mid-year review, that person's ready to go. Those things right there might be on one hand, one might consider them as just something that you should do. You should use your network to advance yourself, right? Like that's just part of being an adult and being, self-advocating. Whereas for another cultural group, that can be seen as negative, right? Self-promotion is perceived as not a good thing. And while social class informs that, so does cultural upbringing as well, because certain cultures very much in the Philippines, and I believe in Japan too, there's this common saying that the nail that sticks up will be hammered down, right? Like everyone should be the same. I know with Japan, with Japanese baseball players, right? Everyone is paid the same, unless that's changed. But last time I checked, everyone is paid the same. Like no one gets to negotiate higher than their colleagues. So there are just certain norms that influence our experiences. So when it comes to the workplace, some of the unspoken cues or hidden cultures that can show up based on class, again, could be for the working class folks, it's often pro-social behavior. And for middle class and upper class individuals, it's more based on political behavior. Now, this does not mean that neither one of these, folks who are raised in either of these groups are incapable, right, of floating in between these different cultures. Most of our society, because we are such an integrated country, we do kind of pick and choose, and we do kind of operate in this mixed space, but there's definitely certain attributes that tend to bubble up and become more prominent than other characteristics. So how this impacts employee experience in the workplace is that employees often who belong to a working class, what we find from research is that they're actually less likely to aspire or seek out promotions or higher ranking positions if they feel that they will be required to engage in what's known as political behavior, because political behavior may directly bump up against the values that have been instilled in them, right? So it's not that they don't think that they're capable of doing the role. It's just that there's some things that they're like, I don't want to have to do that. Like that goes against my values, because there's a different understanding. Again, there's no good or bad, like pro-social versus political. It's not good or bad binary. It just is. And consequently, because of this, working class employees are paid about 20% less than their middle and upper class counterparts. And you can probably imagine how race and gender also, and ability, right, may also intersect and impact that experience. Working class employees are also less likely to seek pay increases. So I want to pause there to check in and see any thoughts or comments about that so far. Is any of this surprising to you, or is any of it affirming?
I found it very interesting. I guess I always wondered why. So when you talk about political behavior, I do run into a lot of people just don't feel comfortable doing it, or they feel it's sleazy or bad, or that's what those people do. I don't want to do that. But from my standpoint, it's like it's required. If you want to get things done, you have to utilize skills and so on and so forth. And so it's just interesting to hear again a perspective of why someone may not want to do this or may feel like that's not what they want to do. And it kind of sucks because then, like you said, those individuals generally paid a lower salary and so on and so forth. There are other implications that can come into play.
Yeah, and I do see your comment, Deirdre, about like military bases. I don't have any documents on that or research on that offhand, but I'm sure it exists out there for sure.
I was just gonna say the information that you've shared so far, it like for me, was known, but it's at the same time to really see the patterns and how it plays out, both like personal and social and different levels within the workplace. Yeah, it brings to light again the patterns of just behaviors and how things are the way they are at times.
Yeah. I'll share this with you all, but I'm gonna just pull this up real quick, if I can find it. That goes into a little bit more deeply. Let me see. And this is from Payne. Oh, come on, open. Here's why it won't. Let me see if I can minimize this. Sorry, friends, I'm going to see if I can open up that document. Okay, it won't, well, that's all right. I will find that and share it after our session today.
Yeah, and something, August, that I'll mention too that I thought was interesting while you find that was some research that like I've done that I know my friend is working on in her master's in education project right now is how our school systems, especially public schools, are built in the same way as prisons. And it's super interesting that like you have a lot of affluent schools that tend to have like, you know, the outdoor access and the forest schools, and, you know, they tend to be built in a different way. But then you have like typically the lower income schools that are built in the same way of prisons. And it's like, it's kind of interesting to hear like all of the stuff that you've talked about so far, because it just makes me think even deeper. I'm like, wow, we're really not doing ourselves justice for people by the way that we, you know, build our schools from the start to finish of people's lives. And it just goes back all the way from the institutional portion of, you know, when somebody's a child all the way through adulthood. It really makes a difference.
Yeah. So here are some common ways, right, that like, again, some of you mentioned about how it like our identities and our experiences like inform how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive others and situations consequently, right? And all of it manifests in what can be known as bias, right? And we all have bias. It's not escapable. We can measure for it. We can build up guardrails for it, but we certainly can't train ourselves out of having it. In fact, you know, I think I mentioned this before, there's significant research to show that the more aware we are that we have unconscious bias actually makes us less likely to place ourselves in experiences where that unconscious bias will be triggered, because we don't want to be the villain in our own story, right? Like there's some cognitive dissonance that happens that we try to avoid as much as possible. So some common ways that overall bias can show up in the workplace are preferences for folks of a higher social class, how white supremacy can be veiled as professionalism, affinity bias, right, like me bias, and also feedback bias. So when I say preferences for higher social class, an example of that was done by a group, and you can find this on the Harvard Business Review website. But a study was done evaluating white men who had the exact same resumes, with the only difference being indicators of social class, right? And so the folks who had a higher, had depicted a higher level of social class received a callback, a percentage of about 16%, while the folks who were, who had depicted a lower class identity received a callback of 1.28%. And so some of the components that were used for the higher socioeconomic status group were around awards, right? So for the higher class group, it was based on athletic awards, versus the lower socioeconomic status group was awards for athletics on financial aid. The music interests that were listed on the internship resumes were classical music for the affluent folks and country music for the lower socioeconomic class folks, right? And again, this is all leaning on assumptions and stereotypes, right, of how this was designed. But it turned out to, you know, prove that like those stereotypes do inform how people perceive others, whether or not people believe those stereotypes. And then lastly, for sports, sport interest, the higher socioeconomic socioeconomic example listed sailing and polo as sports that they engage in versus track and field and pickup soccer. In addition to that, some of the ways that white supremacy can be veiled as professionalism is also around dress, right? So in North America, we have this perception, and it's kind of, I would say, melding out globally too, but the preference for the European suit, right, being the standard for professional dress, which completely disregards like the kurta and the sari, which are also forms of formal, professional dress. But who gets to decide which one of those are considered professional? In addition to this, hair as well, right? So just last week, for those of you who are aware, our country celebrated the passing of the Crown Act, which made hair discrimination illegal. Because up until that point, students were prohibited in many cases from graduating if they didn't cut off or straighten their hair. And when I say students, I'm referring to youth of color, typically. Typically the hair of folks of Caucasian descent are not policed. So this notion that like straight hair, short hair is professional is very much so based around the norms of white identity and Caucasian identity. These are some photos of a young boy who wasn't allowed to walk at graduation unless he had cut off his locks. There are also numerous examples of individuals losing their jobs for failure to comply with the European standardization of conforming their hair to an extent of even using chemical products, significant heat to manipulate the hair and change it from its natural form of growth. Any questions about that before I move on to chronemics or comments?
I mean, just adding that totally also goes into the, socioeconomic ones that we were talking about as well, and access and how people are raised.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it can even be a form of like internalized oppression as well, right? With someone, I share this story often about the second time ever, I've only had to fire 2 people in my whole life, luckily, but the second time I had to let a staff member go was actually a Black female crew leader who told one of our core members that her hair was unprofessional. She was wearing her hair natural, and she was giving her advice on how she should wear her hair, which ended up being that she should straighten it, should tie it back, make it look very contained. And that was really hard for me, really hard for our team members to have to realize that, okay, like this person, while we don't expect perfection, this person is not a safe person to lead a crew like this. And their intention was absolutely good, right? But this is where the impact comes in. It's challenging to have another person of color tell a student of color, a Black child specifically from a Black woman, that like, hey, if you want to be successful in this world, you have to, Caucasify your hair because it's wrong. Like imagine like the messaging of that. Now, again, on the other hand, the person, their lived experience is you don't get far if you don't comply, right? So there's a lot to unpack with this stuff, right? And this is what I mean when I talk about how even for folks of color to learn that the more you align with white supremacy culture and you become fluent in it, there's this false sense of acceptance. But in the end, it's not acceptance really at all. At the end, it doesn't protect anyone.
Yeah, it makes me think this is, I was just learned about this the other day, but the Olympic Committee has banned a specific style of swim cap that's most commonly worn by Black women. And it's like, they didn't even provide explanation as to why it's not being allowed. They just flat out banned it.
Yeah. And it's a great example, Michael, of decisions that are made by folks who are not impacted by the decision, right? I can tell you as someone who barely can stay above water, who could barely not drown in water, I have tried a regular swim cap and it does not, and I don't even have that much hair, but it does not work for me. So I can only imagine someone with more hair than I have, more natural Afro hair. yeah, but again, that was the rationale I believe they said was it doesn't follow the natural curve of one's head, but that of course assumes that one's hair is straight. Yeah. Oh yeah.
And also that I mean, I've never seen a swim cap that looks like someone's head. They all look kind of funny.
Yeah. So let's talk about chronemics for a moment here too, right? Because this is something that I think would be a little bit valuable for you. I know we brought it up last time, but I want to share a quick video on that. So actually, I'm going to stop my video so that it records better.
There's one factor we all share and have equal access to: time. No matter who we are, each day we are presented with 86,400 seconds to use, lose, spend, or save. Not everyone or every culture views or values time the same way. Depending on where you live in the world, you have developed your view of time and what it means to how you conduct your day. One aspect of time that differs among cultures is chronemics, and that is the study of the role of time in communication. Time is money is a key saying in cultures that see time as linear and measured by tangible results. We call these cultures monochronic. In monochronic cultures, you learn sayings like "a stitch in time saves 9" or "time flies." Monochronic cultures see time as linear. Agendas specify how time is used, and the expectation is that certain things will be accomplished within a given time frame. Monochronic cultures set their watches and clocks, and time becomes the designated driver of what happens in the course of a day. In contrast are cultures that may adhere to being more on island time. Polychronic cultures view time not as fixed, but as flexible. What happens in the course of a day is not measured on a to-do list, but more on a "what did you get to do" list. Relationships are as important as tasks in most polychronic cultures. Lunch can run long if we are talking and discussing, well into a monochronic workday. Many things might happen in a meeting that do not relate to a proposed topic. Time is fluid and driven, not by the exact minute, but what is present in the moment. Most of the business world has adopted a monochronic time concept. Emails, project completion, and deadlines demand that we adhere to linear schedules, but much can be learned from stepping back when possible and allowing ourselves to experience time and relationship in a polychronic way. Edward T. Hall, the famous scientist who studied culture, said, 2 points that are very important points to remember and ask: is it real and does it work? Both monochronic time and polychronic time are real, and they both work, just differently, garnering different results and varied experiences.
So in short, chronemics is the study of perceived time, right? And our relationship to time. So for cultures that are monochronic, we tend to value doing one thing at one time, versus polychronic cultures are able to do many things at once, right? They're more multitasking. Monochronic cultures or work styles tend to concentrate specifically on one job, whereas the polychronic work styles can be easily distracted and can manage interruptions well. Monochronic work styles also adhere religiously to plans, whereas polychronic work styles are more committed to people and human relationships than tasks. They also consider an objective to be achieved if it's possible rather than like an absolute. And polychronic work styles are also able to change plans often and easily. Monochronic work styles are concerned about not disturbing others and making sure that they're following explicit rules around privacy, whereas polychronic work styles are more concerned with those they're closely related to than with privacy. Monochronic styles tend to show great respect for private property and seldom borrow and lend things. And folks who come from a more polychronic background are able to borrow and lend things often and easily. Monochronic work styles tend to emphasize promptness, whereas for polychronic work styles, the promptness is based on the relationship. Monochronic work styles are accustomed to short-term relationships that can be perceived as transactional, whereas polychronic work styles have a tendency to build strong, lifelong relationships and are oftentimes very turned off to transactional relationships. Monochronic work styles and cultures are low context, and polychronic cultures are high context. So I'm going to share in a moment what each of these components mean, that low versus high context. But just keep in mind, as we're going through this, I want you to start thinking about which work style, which culture do you kind of fall into, or the people you work with, your family members. Yeah, it definitely can align with the true colors for sure. Okay, one more video.
In a low context society, while we are communicating, we assume that we have a low level of shared context. What does that mean? It means that we don't have the same reference points or the same body of knowledge or relationships, that we have a low level of shared context. So in a low context society, we believe that good, effective professional communication is a communication that's very explicit, that's very simple and very clear. In a low context society, we're trained that if I want you to understand blue, then I have to say blue, literally. We're trained in a low context culture that if I give a presentation, I should tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I should tell you, and then I should tell you what I've told you. Why do I tell you the same thing 3 times? Because we're focused overall on making sure that the message was passed simply and clearly. In a high context society, while we're communicating, we assume or consider that we have a larger body of shared context, that we have the same reference points, body of knowledge, information. And because we assume all of this shared context, in a high context society, we believe good, effective communication is a communication that's more implicit or layered or nuanced. I had a German individual who said to me, you know, Erin, in Germany, at the end of a meeting, we almost always do a recap. First, we do a verbal recap, and then we do a written recap. That's low context, right? Clarification, clarification, clarification. He said, now that I've been working frequently with the French, I often find that at the end of a meeting, I'll get ready to do a recap and my French colleagues will just stand up and someone will say, et voila, there it is. And I'll think to myself, but voila, what? And then I'll be very surprised to see that it just seems that people know what's been decided, that they know what's supposed to happen next without going through all of those levels of clarification that I'm so used to in my own culture. I had a second example. I was doing some work a while ago in Istanbul, and I had a Turkish client who was telling me about all of these issues that he was having with his new American boss. And I said, when your boss was here, did you tell him what you're telling me now? And he said, well, you know, Erin, I made it known so that he could see it if he wanted to see it. And I thought to myself, he probably didn't see it, right? I'll give you a third example from China. I was giving a presentation at a conference in China last year, and all the people in the room worked for the same multinational American company. Before I worked with them, the chairman, who was this American from New York City, gave a presentation that went very well, and then he left. Afterwards, when I was working with the group, we were talking about this, and I had the Chinese human resource director raise his hand, and he said, you know, Erin, this concept is very interesting to me, because the whole time the chairman was talking, I was trying to make sure that I was listening with all of my senses, that I was picking up all of the levels of meaning that he might be trying to pass. Now that I look at this, I'm asking myself the question, is it possible that there was no meaning beyond that, you know, first those simple words that he was saying? And I thought to myself that that chairman would have been really surprised to not think that anyone was trying to understand his message beyond the first degree.
So another thing to consider with like cultural context, right? And social context, if you will, is that there's so many different components to this, right? Another one that might be of interest to some of you is the guess versus ask culture, which is, if any of you come from households where there may have been like some substance abuse, for example, adult children who have grown up in that environment, it is very common for them to be exposed to more of a guess culture, right? Where you don't ask a question unless you know the answer, for example, and you kind of slowly tiptoe around the actual question you want to ask, because if it perhaps would end up being no, there might be some deeper concerns that will manifest from that, versus cultures or backgrounds where, as an example, there is no substance abuse in the household. There's an ask culture where it's like you can ask anything you want. The answer may be yes, it may be no, but if you don't, as my father used to say, if you don't ASK, you don't GET. So, but bringing it back to just the high versus low context cultures, this can correlate to micro like families. It can also be a global thing. As an example, right? Like so French tend to be more low context in culture, whereas and also very, but also could be very monochronic, right? Or polychronic. Actually, no, I would say France is probably more polychronic. Whereas a place like Japan, for example, or China may be more, China's actually kind of half and half monochronic and polychronic, depending on where in the country you are. Like in the mainland, it's more monochronic, but in Hong Kong, it's definitely more polychronic because of the business influence. And Japan, of course, is also more monochronic. But in high context cultures, people tend to feel very responsible for their family members, right? There's a huge focus on saving face, right? And having a very strong, honorable public image. And if anything, I'm just sorry, I forgot it's down there. And if anything jeopardizes that, that can cause significant lack of belonging, right? So one other example that I often tell my crew leaders is, if you are having a conversation and you're trying to correct a behavior or help a core member identify how they can correct their own behavior, but from our North American upbringing, we may perceive a child looking down at their feet, right, as disrespectful, that like they're not listening to us, right? They're not showing us they're hearing us. But in other cultures, right, especially if that child might be Hmong or Vietnamese or Black even, like you don't look someone in the eye, like especially not an elder and not a person of authority, you hang your head down to show respect. And so if we don't have that cultural context, significant miscommunication can come up. So for low context cultures, right, that independence and individualism is very much so emphasized, right? This is my property, that's your property, right? Versus more communal and collective. There's really not much concept around face, right? It's like you just say what you have to say and there it is. And everyone's responsible for themselves rather than this communal kind of perception.
Oh, the first question.
Yeah.
How do you so in situations where it's more of a, it's not not the high context versus low context. I mean, you're like, it's almost like you're, instead of just telling someone what you want them to do, they're somewhat guessing based off of your cues and expressions and all of that. But do you then run in case for situations where people, they didn't do what you wanted them to do because you didn't clarify this is what I want, like not X, Y, and Z. I want A, B, and C. How do you not run into those things?
So is your question like, how, if you don't know someone's like, the cultural context? Sorry, go ahead.
Like the example that was in I think it was in the video. Yeah, with the person the German dude, and he went over to France and meet with them. And at the end of each meeting, he would always with his team say, "Okay, this is what I said. Everyone, we're on the same page." And then everything's wrapped up. Then we leave. And with friends, where everyone just like, okay, we're done. Everyone stood up and walked out, right? If you didn't clarify that everyone knew what their roles are, people may not do their role, and then things drop. So, what do you suggest in those situations where you may have the most misses?
So I believe in setting up multifaceted systems, right? So it's just like as an educator, we would teach to different learning styles. I think we have to do that when we're leading as well. We have to lead to different communication styles. So, you know, as an example, if you're managing for both styles, right, then you simply make sure that rather than saying, you know, okay, meeting's over, like sending that, maybe taking it, if you're the leader, for example, taking it upon yourself to send that recap email out, or creating that as part of your culture and the expectation that at the end of each meeting, here's how we close out. If you're not in a position of leadership and you're not in a position of power to drive that, it might be beneficial to talk to whoever is in charge and say, hey, it would be helpful for me if, you know, we had a standard of how we open up and close meetings, right? So for example, when I first started doing workshops like this, I didn't have like an objectives list in the very beginning. And I would get feedback from certain organizations that would say, like, we want to know what we're about to know, right? And so I just started putting it in. And sometimes I know certain organizations want to have a recap at the end, like, here's what we talked about and here's what we learned. Others are like, why are we going through this again? Like, we know what you just said, right? So I think it just depends on what your needs are. Once you see that things are not working, though, that requires a shift, right? Which is why, I often say the fish rots from the head down. So if you have an expectation of your team members, and let's say you are a low context communicator and stuff isn't getting done, that's your cue to say, all right, I need to provide more context. So rather than saying, hey, could everyone update their calendars? Say instead, can everyone update their calendars by 5 p.m. tomorrow? Right? So now there's clarity around it. So I think just creating guardrails to meet the needs of the different learning styles, right? Much like if you have 2 employees who are greens and 2 employees who are blues, maybe you don't need to have a 20-minute, phone check-in with your greens. Maybe you can send them have a file, for example, like a Google Doc that's your one-on-one check-in with them, where they can answer a bunch of the questions you have for them right in that Google Doc. And then that meeting is now just a 10-minute check-in versus 20 minutes, which they will appreciate. And then your blues, who might need more than that 20 minutes, you can then spend that time building a relationship with them and talking about, like, what's going well, what's not going well, what, like just adjusting your leadership style. I think one of the bigger, where we lose like impact is when we try to force things to fit into, we try to force round pegs into square holes and vice versa. Excuse me. Excuse me, friends. So that would be my recommendation, is rather than trying to force something, identify what the needs are, what the communication style is, and figure out how you can adjust that in a way that meets multiple needs. It doesn't mean you have to like customize every single thing you do to every individual person, but since we know that it's not just Sam's issue, right? Like, this is a whole cultural thing. This is a whole personality thing. Thinking about how can I tailor this to serve as many different communication styles, learning styles as possible, cultural styles as possible.
Thank you so much, August.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments or thoughts? So, and feel free to interrupt me. So that's another thing too, right? Like, for some people who come from more polychronic cultures, like interrupting in the middle of like a conversation or a presentation is like, yeah, whatever. And for others, it's like, oh, that's so rude, right? And so even just like setting that up to say, hey, it's totally okay to do this. I'm all right with that. Whereas other people, and again, this is also where neurodivergence can come in. For some people who might have ADD, interrupting them in the middle of a sentence can just completely throw someone off of like their focus. And now they're like, well, I don't even know what I was saying anymore, right? So we got to let folks in on the secret, right? If this type of style doesn't work for us, let's communicate that with the powers that be. Let's normalize not forcing everyone into the same funnel. And actually like leverage people's skills and strengths instead.
So that is actually one thing I'll say again. I wanted to ask, at what point, it's obviously the leader's responsibility to do their best to communicate effectively to their team. That is the leader's responsibility. At what level is it? At what? I guess I don't know if it's percentage. How much is on the employee to then communicate? Say, look, this isn't working for me, or this is the challenges I'm having.
Yeah, and you're agreeing, right, Alex?
No,
No?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I was actually one of those people who my scores are like 1 and 2 off against all of them.
Oh, okay. Okay. Because the question about, not to label you and put you in like a box, but
Yeah.
the question about what percentage just like brought that up for me, because I don't think it's really about what percentage of time do we need to allocate to this or that. I think it's more so a question of, have we created the opportunity for this to happen? Right. So for example, if advocacy is a concern, if I know that certain team members of mine are never going to send me an unsolicited email outlining all the awesome things they've done this month, I need to create that opportunity for them to do that, right? And so then it's on me to put in my check-in notes, ask them about this, about that, right? Give them a form, maybe, for example, to fill out, so that it's seen as part of their job, not as bragging, right? Because someone might see it as self-advocacy and just, hey, my boss is busy, I want to let them know what I'm working on. And for another, it might seem like, well, that's presumptive, right? So measuring for that, just asking ourselves, what systems do I have in place to support these various styles?
Thank you, August. I think it comes from also being raised in a military family. Like everything was very, very structured. My grandfather, my dad, also.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, orange green. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Raphael. I knew I sensed a little green in there. And Alex is on the fun team too, with not that the other colors can't be fun, but oranges are usually pretty fun. All right. So let's talk about, again, so some tips, not only for leaders, but also for those of us receiving feedback also, right? So bias in feedback can manifest as vague, for example, right? So this is feedback that we are given or that we give that isn't really tied to any specific outcomes, right? So an example of this is, Tim had a good quarter. Okay, like, why was it a good quarter? How is that measured, right? There are definitely going to be times when we do want to measure things. Team-oriented feedback, right? This is feedback that is oriented to the team outcomes and not very individualistic. I don't know, I know you all are very spread out around the nation. In the Midwest, with a lot of my Midwest clients, one of the biggest struggles I find folks have around giving feedback is around critical feedback. Nobody wants to be the bearer of critical news, right? And so what often happens is our leaders end up tiptoeing around the actual issue and just hoping that their employee will just pick up on their unhappiness and unsatisfaction and fix the issue. And what ends up happening instead is now the person's, on either getting fired or on, some sort of written whatever, or they're ready to fire the person. And the executive director is like, you can't fire them. Like, where is the documentation that you've talked to them about this issue, right? Well, you have to give folks an opportunity to improve. And since that conversation never happened, that person then doesn't know, like, oh, that they weren't let in on the secret. So we want to make sure that our feedback is absolutely tied to specifics, and that we're also not just giving team-oriented feedback, right? So as example, this one says, Stephanie's team delivered an excellent final report. Well, maybe they did, but how did Stephanie contribute to that, right? What did she do to facilitate that performance? Fixed mindset, right? So Marcus is a great designer, right? We're labeling people rather than focusing in on the skills or what they did to accomplish a particular task. And the danger in labeling anyone is that it creates this unspoken assumption that someone is either good at something or bad at something. And so then when we think of who do we get to design this flyer, oh, let's go to Marcus. He's a great designer, even though Marcus may have other interests and other skills, and someone else may also have that capacity that never got the opportunity because we didn't label them as such. Personality style feedback as well. This is something that's very commonly imparted onto female staff, right? Feedback about someone's tone or personality, their communication style, right? At times, Sarah can be a little abrasive in meetings. What does that mean, right? Like we need some more specifics. And also, who is evaluating this level of abrasiveness? Right? Is it because Sarah isn't adding exclamation points behind her emails? Is it because she's not keeping her voice super high and cheery? Like, is she just directly saying that's wrong versus saying, oh, I don't know, I think that might not be exactly correct? Like, what is it that we're navigating through? Because oftentimes those assumptions are very much so, it's different, right? And much like the model minority myth, the same characteristics that we tend as a society to be conditioned to view as great leadership characteristics are not neutral. They're definitely not gender neutral. And so those same characteristics, when embodied by a female identified or even non-binary identified individual, are not often as welcome as they are from a male identified individual. I'm just going to pause there and check the chat for a moment here. Yeah. Yeah, there's very much so a double standard. So let's test this out. Oh, darn it, it's already, okay. Well, I was hoping to have you all identify this yourselves. I apologize. But so here's an example, right? So this Lisa is such a great manager. What's the problem with that? What type of feedback is that? Labeling, yep. And what else is it? What does labeling do? I'll bring it back up again, one more up again.
Fixed mindset.
Yeah, fixed mindset. What about, however, some people find that, what's the issue with that? Some people find, who's some people? Yeah, vague. We don't know who some people are. And then speaking style, right? What's that? What's our issue with that being the critique? Speaking style. Is she saying a lot? Yeah, it's personality based. Yeah, off-putting at times, and her approach could be softened, right? So I'll share this link as well, this bias interrupters worksheet after today. So time for a little reflection, friends. So what I'd like for you to do is think about which chronemic culture, polychronic or monochronic, is most prominent for you, right? In your family, in your cultural community, and in the workplace, right? And I'd like you to think about how have these differences and or similarities and alignments or misalignments, have they impacted your lived experience? And if you have time and you want to talk about those other components like high context, low context, that's fine too. But I want you to really think about how, concepts of time, and these various cultural components that we just went over, how do those show up? What is that? What is the meaning behind that? And does your social identity play in, or how does your social identity play into that as well? All right. So I'm going to get ready to break you out into groups. Feel free to take a screenshot. Oops. Okay. All right. So if you end up being in a room by yourself, just come back into the main room. I think maybe all of you should be good though. No, I want There we go. Make sure no one's alone. Any questions before I open up your breakout rooms? Just check how much time we have. Yes. Okay, you know what? Actually, yes. I think we should all take a bio break. Let's take a 5-minute bio / like stand-up break and let's reconvene. Actually, let's reconvene. We'll do more than 5 minutes. Let's reconvene at 2:30 Central Time. So 7 minutes. How's that sound, friends? 2:30 Central? Okay. See, that's my monochronic, like, go, 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 like that I'm trying to unlearn. It's like quantity over quality. All right, I will see you all back at 2:30 Central Time. So 7 minutes. Welcome back from your breakout rooms. So, let's see, we'll give everyone a chance to come back in.
So as I was saying, buy low, sell high. That's what you got. Oh, sorry, I didn't know we were back in normal session.
Welcome, welcome. All right. So would anyone like to share some things some reflections from their group?
I'll share one. My group member can pick others because I think we discussed a lot of really great stuff. Just, you know, mono versus poly. I mean, it's what's rewarded. I mean, generally speaking, in the workplace, mono here in America, mono is rewarded, and so it's if you're good at it, it's really hard to step back and not be so focused on the time and managing it. And It's very difficult because again, it's worked. Why would I stop doing something that's worked, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I will say it probably doesn't work for everyone though, right? Like some people are really drawn to companies that are more personalized, right? That actually take the time to build a relationship with their clients, perhaps as a teacher even, right? Like
Absolutely. I more so I meant like it's worked for me or the person. You know, if someone has rose into a CEO of a corporation, whatever they've done has worked, right? And so to tell them they to do something different, it's a stretch sometimes for that person. And again, so we were having a conversation like how do we integrate more poly into our approaches?
Yeah, I like that.
In our group, right at the end, we started to talk about how there's a little bit of tension in the history of schooling in this country, where schooling for working class communities and things like that has been a whole lot more structured and geared towards producing industrial factory workers and folks like that. But those same individuals might be coming from polychronic cultures where they are less sort of hardwired to deal with that stuff, and a more affluent schooling where gray areas and nuance and sort of managerial focus has been much more, we're dealing with pulling from cultures that have more of a monochronic history.
For sure. Yeah.
Something else that we talked about in our group too was, you know, we at ACE, I think, have we have variety with folks who are polychronic versus monochronic in terms of where they've grown up and everything and identities that they've had. But ACE as a whole seems to be more monochronic. And so it's like, how can we work to be more polychronic, especially when we have such a fast-paced organization, you know, with certain needs that in some cases, yeah, timing really does matter, you know, and we do have certain to-dos that have to get done. And so it's like, how can we better work to make sure that, you know, we are inviting to people who have polychronic cultures and make ourselves more polychronic, because I feel like it's just, it looks like it's such a big and daunting task, but it's something that probably needs to come in order to be able to achieve better success and inclusivity within our organization.
Yeah, yeah. And can we identify, right, where we can have some flexibility, right? And where, and also maybe even pointing out examples of where the polychronic approach, for example, has been really helpful, right? Whether it's community organizing or supporting core members, right? Or versus, you know, getting things out the door by a certain time frame. Right? And like making sure everyone understands why that is. So I see your question, Colin. Is the task distinct from the relationship when the relationship exists as a consequence of the task? I
Yeah,
think-
and the only reason any of us are talking right now is we have a relationship with ACE. So trying to tease this out, you know, you're going to have a monochronic instance in a polychronic context and vice versa. So the distinction, to me, it doesn't really mean anything. I get where it's going, but it's really, it's carving things out without an identified benefit as far as I can tell.
Say more about that, carving things out without a identified benefit.
I mean, it's essentially, it's going down a path that I see fruitless in terms of understanding each other and how we're going to engage in any given moment, because it's creating a duality where really none exists. This would all obviously be on a spectrum, as we've talked about. So is the language of polychronic versus or in opposition to monochronic meaningful in our conversations? I'm mostly of the position that no, it's not.
Are there any other thoughts about that?
Something that came up in the room that I was in, because I was paired with someone else who grew up in a military family, was the idea that it's nice to have the awareness of both. Because for me personally, I grew up in a very monochronic Army family, but that doesn't work with my personality naturally. So I always struggled with that. And then as an adult, I've shifted towards more poly, but I can do both, and it's situational. So if I'm in a situation where one is more conducive to whatever's going on, I can do that. Or if one is less stressful, I can do that. And it's kind of a balance of taking care of myself and doing whichever one is least stressful for me, but also taking care of whatever I'm working on and doing whichever one that best fits the situation.
Yeah.
My team member, this is Alex, if my team member wants to speak on this, and I think there was a great example of how you can, why it's valuable to understand mono versus poly and what you're doing and being aware of what other people may find of value. I think the example was, he provided the example, the specifics, but more so, you know, the organization operated from a mono standpoint. This is how we do it. And when they got their job done, but everyone they served, of like 90%, it's not like 90% of the people they served, yes, they got through the process, but they did not get high scores in regards to people wanting to work with them again. So you can get the job done and kill off a relationship and never do anything again with them again, but you got the job done. So I think I think it is important to understand how other people operate.
Yeah.
I chatted a little bit in my group about how I had a job earlier in my, like pretty early on in my career, where I ended up in an office space that was very much polychronic. And I felt very uncomfortable in that workplace because, you know, I'd show up and the program director would be like out chatting with everyone for like an hour before anyone got to work. And it just felt really like, I very much value like be working when I'm at work. And I think at the time, you know, it was pretty early on in my career and I didn't really have the words to articulate why I felt so uncomfortable in that workspace. But now, like reflecting on it, I think it makes a lot of sense that like that just wasn't what I was used to, and it did put me outside of my comfort zone because it was so opposite to what I'd been trained to think of a workplace as being. So yeah, I think it's just interesting. Like I definitely have reflected on that experience a lot since then, and it just didn't feel like the right fit for me at the time. But I think thinking about it differently now, I would probably be more open to that experience than I was at that moment in my career. Yeah.
Mhm. Could that be, Zoe, because perhaps now in your career you have more language to advocate for yourself of like, hey, this is what works for me and what doesn't, or is it just that you would know how to navigate that in a way where it wouldn't become like a negative like impact onto you?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both. I think I have more language now, and I think I also have maybe a more nuanced idea of expectations. I think that was one of the things that felt uncomfortable to me, was that I couldn't really understand what the expectations were of me in that workplace, because it didn't, you know, like value traditional, like, you know, complete X number of assignments or this many hours in a day. So yeah, I think just being more open to those different types of communication. But it also just made me reflect on like how I really do value like being at work when I'm at work and like getting a lot done and like having that sense of achievement. And it's really hard to disentangle that from my like work life experiences. So
yeah. Peter, I'm wondering if you can speak more to what you shared in the chat.
Sorry, my computer wasn't responding.
No worries.
And I had food in my mouth. To the comment about like knowing in advance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in traveling to do site visits, I'm thinking particularly island communities, you know in advance you're about to walk into a different community, a community with perhaps different cultural norms. And that's a little easier to prepare for, perhaps, that you may have to reset your expectations or just think differently. But when you're engaging somebody in perhaps your own work environment, you don't necessarily know what their expectations may be. You may have to ask, or you may have to create space to invite that feedback before you end up with a result that wasn't what you hoped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And one thing that I hope to highlight again, and chronemics is just one component of this, right? We've talked about a lot of things today to be mindful of. And my hope in all of this is for us to be able to identify, like, what are some of our hidden rules of engagement, right? What are some things that we are assuming everyone just knows versus not, right? And can we, oh, Alex, we have till 3:30. I just saw your text. So making sure that we're making the implicit like explicit, because there's a product that's coming out from our culture, right? And so if we are saying, well, this is just the way things are, this is just how we navigate the world, this is just how we communicate, these are the expectations we hold people to, and yet only certain avatars of people are finding success in the industry, that's something to look at, right? And it might behoove us to examine, like, does it truly need to be done this way all day, every time, right? And can we find examples of when that's actually not the case? And has that been helpful? Has it been harmful? And perhaps could a shift or a more inclusive approach rather than this one-dimensional approach support us in attracting and retaining and equitably promoting even folks who perhaps navigate the world of work, the environment differently than us? Because while you all, yes, are brought together to work for ACE, I'm sure you all have very unique reasons and stories of why you're passionate about the work you do at all, right? ACE may be the, you know, the place where that work is happening now, but is how ACE is functioning now, is that going to keep you engaged, right? Like, who does it work for? Who does it not work for? Okay, I'm just checking the chat one more time. Yeah, Kenzie, okay. Yeah, and again, there's no right or wrong, good or bad, right? It's just acknowledging there's different styles and that we can absolutely design our culture to accommodate both or all. It's not even binary too. We're using two binary examples, but let's be real, most of us operate somewhere in the middle. We might be leaning one way more or the other, and that can also be situational, right? So, all right. So here's some other examples right now. Again, this is presented in a more binary way, but keep in mind, this is a spectrum. So, you know, just having awareness around communication, right? Like low context versus high context, monochronic versus polychronic, collectivism versus individualism, your leadership structure, right? Is it egalitarian or is it hierarchical? Is your focus on rules or relationships? Are you task-based or are you relationship-based, right? Where are these components valuable? And I would probably argue that for a lot of us, it's somewhere in the middle. And again, as I mentioned, situational. But the more conscious we are of where we are in the moment, we can then evaluate if we're perhaps leaning too heavily on one side or the other. So some last considerations for class migration I want to talk about that can come up for folks who are migrating through class based on, you know, marriage or career change or promotion or whatnot, would be covering, stereotype threat, and also racial battle fatigue, right? So some examples well, before I get into that, all three of these components produce what's known as cognitive overload, right? It is the unnecessary spending of our cognitive abilities on things that really don't produce the best, are not the best use of our team members and of our time. It's primarily a response to stress, and that is very much so preventable, right? So who's here is familiar with covering as it relates to class migration? Have any of you heard that term before, covering? No worries. So covering is a term used to describe an action that someone may take when they are one of the few of their identity groups, identities within a particular group, right? So for example, if someone comes from a white working class background, let's say from rural Wisconsin, and they are working alongside some, you know, generationally wealthy individuals who have some stereotypes about what they think being from rural Wisconsin is in working class. And let's say for them, that means making jokes about NASCAR, right? The person who's now in that class, right, even though they maybe were raised under a different socioeconomic class, may feel the need to like laugh along with the joke, even though it's highly offensive and incorrect, right? They might feel like, well, you know what, I don't want to risk my sense of belonging by saying, yo, like that's not cool. Like, actually, that's kind of stereotypical. Or even, you know, just to assume that liking NASCAR is somehow less, you know, valuable than something else. That person may choose to just cover. Stereotype threat, for example, is just being afraid of fulfilling a stereotype, right? So perhaps a female employee who is working in a predominantly male industry, who's a leader, for example, may feel like they have to embody more masculine or what's perceived to be masculine traits and characteristics, and try to stifle some of their more feminine characteristics for fear of being perceived less qualified, for example. And that might be, you know, to the extent of, it might seem like no big deal to have to think every day, okay, what am I going to wear to work so that I'm not perceived too feminine, right? Like, is this enough makeup? Not enough? Like, and that's a lot of cognitive energy that is spent on things that we shouldn't need to spend our cognitive energy on. But because it's natural for us as human beings to desire a sense of belonging and emotional and physical safety, all of that comes into play, whether we are even conscious of it or not. Racial battle fatigue isn't so much a class migration thing, but it can be correlated, especially as it relates to becoming influential and acquiring perhaps wealth or higher socioeconomic status, where there might be some fear of, not even fear, but having to navigate and be around individuals who are not of your same racial background, having to being asked to represent your entire identity group, while also even constantly being on the receiving end of traumatic news stories, or, you know, even discussions. Sometimes even workshops like this can produce significant racial battle fatigue. For example, as for some folks, right, as I mentioned before, maybe studying the impacts of racial inequity, and other people are living it based on their racial identity. To be in the same space with someone essentially arguing whether or not that exists, like racial equity exists or gender inequity exists, for example, can be traumatic and harmful for a person experiencing gender inequity, experiencing sexual, like, discrimination based on sexual orientation, experiencing racism, right? Because it's kind of, it holds a lot of weight, and yet to have to navigate that experience, attempting to maintain relationships so you can still get your job done, right? Well, not leaving your whole identity at the door, because a lot of us don't have the capacity to do that. It's just not possible. All of that can produce that cognitive overload that almost can manifest in us not even being able to do our job correctly. So, which essentially becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of assumptions around, well, see, this is why we don't hire women, or, you know, we'd love to hire people of color, but, you know, they have to be qualified, right? And having this exceptionalist expectation that if we hire a person of color, they have to have a PhD when everybody else who's white barely has a bachelor's, right? And same thing for gender and, you know, and neurodiversity and whatnot. So here's why all of this matters. It affects our relationships, right? And how we communicate with others, how we treat those around us, as was mentioned earlier when we think about our social identities. And our identity also informs our own self-concept, confidence, and our perception of ability to take on certain roles, responsibilities, and even to aspire to certain career goals. And awareness or lack thereof can contribute to sense of belonging or exclusion due to one's comfort with others or familiarity with a certain professional or social environment. And that sense of exclusion that one can feel from their family or from, like, their class of origin when their social class does change through education or employment or life partnerships can also be very isolating to experience. And lastly, because it influences our perception and our decisions, right? Around money, around power, around status, around organizational structure, what policies we impart on, how we design our management structure. All of these, our social identities, all of our cultural norms, right? Whatever they may be, all of those serve to inform how we interact with one another day to day. And so when we're looking at who is making decisions, it's imperative that we ask the question of who's missing from this decision-making space here, right? Because the reality is we're going to have some blind spots and we're never going to get it perfectly, but we do want to at least place ourselves as and position ourselves as aligned as we possibly can be with representation of individuals from particular backgrounds, specifically marginalized, racialized individuals. Because if you don't have anyone at the table who can say, hey, you know, that might not actually work for this particular community, right? Or I use the example of working with Indigenous communities all the time where, you know, in a monochronic environment, for example, we might be very focused on hierarchy. And to us, hierarchy is about titles. Whereas for many Indigenous cultures, it is correlated to the elders, right? And so someone might have the title of director, but yet that person is beholden to the directive of an elder in that community. And if you don't know that going into it, we run the risk of being very offensive, right? And harming that relationship. So what do we do about all this, right? Where do we go from here? Well, as I mentioned, we want to identify what our hidden rules are. What have they been? And identify where we can make our opportunities more accessible to folks. If we identify where we are, and we're going to do this with our assessment to see who exactly do we have on the platform, right? Like who do we have within our organization, not just from an assumption standpoint, but from self-reported. And then we can see from there, are there concrete disparities in representation? If so, how do we make opportunity more accessible, more inclusive? I also say to mind meritocracy, right? Meritocracy is the belief that the most successful person wins, right? The best idea wins. And we actually know that that's not the case all the time, right? Especially because merit has its own issues, right? We know that Jeff Bezos is not working any harder than, you know, a woman in, you know, a country in Africa gathering water right now. But again, it's our perception of, again, class and whatnot. We also want to measure our efforts and measure successes, right? So we're going to be trying a lot of different things. And I encourage you to not stay married to the policy and the practice, but rather get married to your desired outcome and be willing to shift if your current process or policy is not producing the outcome that you want or that you need. Also, we want to be assessing employee experiences intersectionally, which again, we are going to be doing, and I encourage you to do going forward. And then influence the industry. ACE absolutely is positioned to influence the industry, whether it's philanthropic institutions, your colleagues who are also working in conservation, government entities. We can absolutely influence industry. And then lastly, begin connecting with talent early. Take a look at where you're currently sourcing your candidates from, right? Do those sources have diversity to give, right? And if not, let's broaden that pool, okay? All right, friends, that's all I've got for you today. Happy to take any, we've got a couple more minutes if anyone has any comments or questions. But otherwise, thank you so much.
August, earlier you mentioned something that I've heard a few times. You said basically, you know, willing to accept diversity if they're qualified. Can you say more on that? That I think I've heard that.
Yeah.
Before.
Yeah, I think even the question alone is rooted in racism, right? So the question of, well, we would love to diversify, or the statement, we would love to diversify our organization, but we have to hire qualified people. We never say that, right? When we're talking about hiring white people into our organizations, into our already predominantly white institution, like that doesn't become a question. So this assumption basically that the quality of work from people who are different automatically equates to subpar is concerning, and something that I think we should evaluate a bit deeper, right? So this is also why I share this context of different cultural communication styles and leadership styles, because we've been conditioned to treat one type of way of doing things as the right way, without ever actually questioning why that is. It's just, oh, so many other people are doing it, so many other organizations are doing it, so that must be the right way, rather than where did this actually come from, right? who decided that this was the right way and everything else was wrong, or even like different and subpar? So what I often see in a lot of our environmental organizations is that, so for example, I'll use an example of a former client who wanted to hire an intern, wanted it to be, you know, intentionally targeting communities of color. But then on the job description, he said, well, you know, I want them to be able to do marketing and also be able to like, to have full on plant ID experience and also have this many years of supervisory experience and all of these things, right? And all of a sudden I'm like, how much are you going to pay this intern? And he says, $10 an hour. And I'm like, I don't know managers with all these skills that like you're asking for. And so it kind of becomes this excuse of like, oh, well, see, we'd love to diversify our workforce, but no one is up to par. Like, why are we looking for a college degree, for example, for a task that doesn't actually correlate to an actual degree? Like, why is that the measure of intelligence, right? I use the example of like the trail coordinator position, where there's no trail building degree. So why are we requiring that? Why is that the marker? So yeah, like just being really honest with ourselves about some assumptions that we have about difference, and being honest and honestly evaluating, why do we consider that difference subpar to the status quo?
Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Colin. Any other thoughts? Let me catch up with the chat here. Any last questions or comments from folks? All right. So I'll be sending out via Alex some just a couple documents, like the I think it's Ruth Payne's hidden rules for success. Again, caveat, there are definitely some very valid criticisms of her work, specifically as it relates to the school system. There are some educators that feel solely focusing in on, you know, socioeconomics, you know, excuses teachers from shifting the way that they teach, and kind of dismisses it as like, oh, well, you know, this socioeconomic class is just this way, and so therefore they're not going to be successful. And that's not my fault as the educator, as the institution. But I think from where we are, having started with understanding how our societal inequities have manifested, I don't see that as a potential problem, but just note that disclaimer. And then I will also share with you all a bias interrupters document to help interrupt perhaps some of those potential biases that are common in the workplace as we're having conversations about shifting and becoming a more anti-oppressive, inclusive organization.
August, I'm wondering if you also have an accompanying resource that speaks to that interesting psychology of avoiding our newly discovered biases, and if there are any tools to navigate that.
Yeah,
not that it's newly discovered for everyone, but that idea.
Let me make a note of that to send you. Yeah, avoiding bias triggers, bias interrupters, and Ruth Payne's document. Okay. All right, friends. I'll give you back 6 minutes of your life. All right, turning it over to you, Alex.
Laura, do you have? Thank you so much. As always, Laura, do you have any thoughts you have to share with the group as we close up today?
I'm frantically unmuting. No, I learned a lot today. I hope others did too. Yeah, thanks. I just like to thank everybody each week for sticking with this. I know we're super busy, so really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Laura. And I'll double down what you said. Thank you to everyone who's been participating all these times. We've had a consistent 50 odd number each time. I'm super stoked. And if you have found value in this, which I hope you have, encourage your colleagues to jump on. We have a few more sessions with August, and we'd love the more the merrier, more ideas and thoughts and conversation the merrier. Again, once I get, I've been trying to send out the new documents from August, as well as the link on Mondays. Today I sent it out today because today was our Monday, but I'll get it out again next week on Monday prior to next week's session. And thank you everyone again. Have a wonderful day. Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.